Every woman in 1950s America knew the recipe. It never appeared in any cookbook or television advertisement. It passed from mother to daughter, usually on a Monday morning, over a steaming washtub. 3 ingredients: a bar of soap, borax, and washing soda. Together they could clean a family's wardrobe for weeks. But by the end of the decade, that recipe was vanishing. A product in bright orange packaging had arrived on store shelves, backed by one of the most sophisticated marketing campaigns ever seen. So what happened to the recipe every woman once knew? The answer starts long before the 1950s, in a time when making soap was as ordinary as baking bread. For most of American history, soap was something you made at home. The process was simple in concept, but demanding in practice. A woman would collect cooking grease and rendered animal fat, usually tallow from beef or lard from pork, and store it in a tin bucket near the stove. When she had saved enough, she'd combine that fat with lye water. Lye itself came from wood ash. Families would pour rainwater through a barrel of hardwood ashes, and the liquid that dripped out the bottom was potassium hydroxide, a strong alkaline solution that could burn skin on contact. Mixing this caustic liquid with melted fat required careful stirring over low heat, sometimes for hours. The chemical reaction that followed was called saponification, and when it worked, the result was a firm, pale block of homemade lye soap. The smell of soap-making day was distinctive. It was a heavy, tallowy scent that lingered in the kitchen for hours, mixing with wood smoke and the sharp bite of lye. Children were kept away from the pot. Dogs were shooed off the porch. One splash of lye water on bare skin raised an angry red welt, and more than a few women carried small scars on their hands and forearms from years of making soap without gloves. Once the soap hardened, usually after sitting in a wooden mold for a day or two, it was cut into blocks and stored in a cool, dry place. A single batch of lye soap could last a household for months. Women used it for laundry, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and bathing. It was rough and unscented, nothing like the perfumed bars sold in drugstores today, but it worked. That soap was the foundation of the laundry recipe. A woman would take a block of it and shave it into thin curls using a kitchen knife or a cheese grater. Those shavings dissolved in hot water to form a sudsy base that could lift dirt out of fabric. On its own, lye soap was a decent cleaner, but generations of trial and error had taught women to add 2 more ingredients that made it far more effective. The first was borax, sold commercially since 1891 under the brand name 20 Mule Team Borax. This naturally occurring mineral had been hauled out of the California desert by teams of mules pulling massive wagons through Death Valley. Borax softened hard water, boosted cleaning power, and helped brighten whites. A box of it sat on the shelf of nearly every farmhouse laundry room in America. But borax alone wasn't enough. The second addition was washing soda, also known as sodium carbonate. Arm & Hammer had been selling it for decades, and its alkaline properties helped cut through grease and oil. Together with borax and soap, it created a cleaning mixture that could handle the heavy, sweat-soaked, dirt-caked clothing of families who worked with their hands. The proportions varied slightly from household to household, but the standard recipe was remarkably consistent. 1 bar of soap, shaved fine, then half a cup of borax, and 1 cup of washing soda. Some women dissolved the soap shavings in boiling water first to create a liquid concentrate. Others mixed everything dry and stored it in a coffee tin, scooping out a few tablespoons per load. Either way, a single batch could last a family of 4 for 2 months or more, and the total cost was a few cents. By the time a girl reached her teens, she'd usually watched this recipe being prepared dozens of times. She knew which soap her mother preferred, how fine to grate it, and how much washing soda to add if the well water ran hard that season. This wasn't exotic knowledge. It was basic household literacy. as common as knowing how to fry an egg or mend a torn hem. But knowing the recipe was only half the story. The other half was the labor of putting it to use. In most American homes during the first half of the 20th century, Monday was laundry day. Not by choice, but by necessity. Washing clothes was such an enormous physical undertaking that it required its own dedicated day, and the rest of the week's schedule was built around it. Tuesday was for ironing. Wednesday was for mending. The week began at the washtub and never quite escaped its gravity. The morning started early, often before sunrise. Water had to be heated on the stove or over a fire, then carried bucket by bucket to the washing area. In many rural homes, this meant a back porch or a corner of the kitchen. In others, it meant a dark, damp basement. Either way, the woman of the house would fill one tub with hot, soapy water and a second with cold rinse water, and the work would begin. Clothes were sorted into strict categories. Whites came first, because they went into the cleanest, hottest water. Light-colored garments came next. Dark clothes followed. Work clothes and rags went last, into water that had already been used and reused. Nothing was wasted. Not the water, not the soap, not a single minute of the day. The scrubbing itself was done on a washboard, a ribbed metal or glass surface set into a wooden frame. A woman would take each garment, rub it against the ridged surface with the heel of her hand, dip it, wring it, and repeat until the fabric was clean. Stubborn stains got a direct application of Fell's naphtha soap, a yellow laundry bar that had been a standard in American homes since 1893. The story of how it came to exist was as practical as the product itself. A man named Lazarus Fells had purchased a lot of pig carcasses from a failed meatpacking operation in North Carolina, rendered the fat, and mixed it with lye to make soap. The family business struggled for years, moving from Baltimore to Philadelphia, before his son, Samuel Simeon Fells, figured out how to add naphtha, a petroleum-based solvent, to the formula. The result was a bar of soap that cut through grease and grime more effectively than anything else on the market. By the 1930s, the Fells factory in southwest Philadelphia employed more than 600 workers producing the yellow bars. The product was exported to England and sold across Europe. But its most loyal customers were always the American women who rubbed it into collars and cuffs the way a carpenter applies sandpaper to rough wood. Its sharp, clean scent was unmistakable, and for millions of families, it was as much a part of Monday as the washtub itself. If the family owned a wringer washer, the work was slightly less punishing. These machines had a small tub with a paddle agitator that had churned the clothes through soapy water. When the cycle finished, the woman would feed each piece of clothing through a set of rubber rollers at the top, squeezing out the water in a flat, steady press. It was efficient, but dangerous. More than a few women lost fingertips or badly bruised their hands when fabric caught in the rollers and pulled their fingers through. And the washing was only part of the physical toll. After washing and rinsing, every item had to be carried outside and hung on the clothesline. Sheets, shirts, trousers, undergarments, tea towels, socks, and cloth diapers all went up on the line, fastened with wooden clothespins. In summer, the sun dried everything in a few hours. In winter, the clothes froze stiff on the wire, and women would carry them inside like boards, draping them over chairs and radiators to thaw. It's hard to imagine doing this every week through an entire winter. A full laundry day from first kettle of water to last clothespin could take 8 to 10 hours. By the end of it, a woman's hands were raw and red, her back ached from bending over the tub, and her arms were sore from the wringing and lifting. And this happened every single week, without exception. Wash day itself, though, was only the beginning of the labor. Tuesday brought ironing, which was nearly as demanding. Before wrinkle-free fabrics existed, every shirt, every blouse, every tablecloth, and every pillowcase had to be pressed with a heavy flat iron, heated on the stove. Women kept 2 or 3 irons going at once, rotating them between the stovetop and the ironing board, so there was always a hot one ready. Dress shirts required starch, which was mixed from flour and water, then applied to collars and cuffs before pressing. A skilled homemaker could work through a mountain of wrinkled laundry in 4 or 5 hours, but only if she kept moving without stopping. And she still wasn't done. Wednesday was mending day, when torn seams were stitched, missing buttons replaced, and thin spots in socks darned with needle and thread. In a household where clothing was expensive and wardrobes were small, extending the life of every garment wasn't optional. It was economic survival. This 3-day cycle, washing, ironing, and mending, repeated 52 weeks a year. There weren't any vacation days from laundry. There was no calling in sick. The clothes got dirty, and the clothes got washed. And the woman of the house was the one who made it happen. The world, the homemade laundry recipe belonged to. It worked, it was affordable, and it demanded everything a woman had to give. But there was a problem with the old recipe that no amount of borax could fully solve. The problem was hard water. Across much of the American Midwest, the Great Plains, and the rural South, well water contained high concentrations of dissolved calcium and magnesium. When homemade soap met hard water, it did not dissolve cleanly. Instead, it formed a sticky, grayish residue called soap curd. This curd clung to fabric, left whites looking dingy, faded colors, and created a film that no amount of rinsing could fully remove. Women fought this problem constantly. They added extra borax to soften the water. Some boiled whites separately with a splash of bleach. Others soaked garments overnight in washing soda solutions. Some collected rainwater specifically for laundry because rain contained none of the minerals that caused the trouble. In parts of rural Kentucky and West Virginia, families rigged up rain barrels under their roof gutters for exactly this purpose, saving every drop for Monday's wash. Then there were the bluing agents. Tiny bottles of liquid bluing, usually a suspension of synthetic ultramarine or Prussian blue, were added to the final rinse water. The blue tint did not actually whiten fabric. It created an optical illusion, counteracting the yellowish-gray cast that soap curd left behind. It was a trick, but an effective one, and bottles of Mrs. Stewart's bluing were as common in the laundry room as clothespins. These workarounds helped, but none of them solved the underlying chemistry. The soap itself wasn't the issue. The issue was that traditional soap, whether homemade from lye and fat or purchased as a commercial bar, was chemically unable to function properly in mineral-rich water. It was a limitation baked into the very nature of the product. Solving that problem would require a fundamentally different kind of chemistry. And inside a laboratory in Cincinnati, Ohio, one determined scientist had been working on exactly that for longer than most people could believe. His name was David Byerly, and he worked for Procter & Gamble. In the 1930s, the company gave Byerly a research assignment they called Project X. The goal was ambitious. He wanted to develop the world's first heavy-duty synthetic laundry detergent, a product that could clean fabric in any water, hot or cold, hard or soft, without leaving residue. Byerly worked on the problem for 7 years before Procter & Gamble shut down the project. But Byerly did not stop. He continued experimenting in secret, driven by a conviction that the solution was close. He spent another 7 years refining formulas, testing compounds, and failing repeatedly before he finally cracked the problem. The breakthrough was a synthetic surfactant, a cleaning agent made from petroleum-based chemicals rather than animal fat. Unlike traditional soap, this surfactant did not react with the minerals in hard water. It dissolved cleanly, lifted dirt efficiently, and rinsed away without leaving any film or residue. When Procter & Gamble saw what Byerly had created, they moved fast. In 1946, the company launched Tide, calling it the Wash Day Miracle. The bright orange box appeared on grocery store shelves across the country, and the response was immediate. Demand was so intense that for the first 5 years, sales were limited only by how fast the factory could produce it. By 1949, Tide was the #1 selling laundry detergent in the United States, a position it has held ever since. By the early 1950s, it controlled more than 30% of the American laundry market. And Procter & Gamble did something clever to make sure every new homeowner tried it. They packed a free box of Tide inside every new automatic washing machine sold in America. Think about that for a moment. Every family that bought a new washer in the 1950s opened the lid and found a box of Tide waiting inside, like a gift from the future. A small gesture, but calculated brilliantly. If you are finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every week, the kind of forgotten history that shaped how we live today. Now, Tide may have been a scientific breakthrough, but science alone didn't convince millions of women to abandon a recipe that had worked for generations. That took something far more persuasive. It took storytelling. Long before television commercials, long before the orange Tide box became a kitchen staple, soap companies had already figured out how to reach the American housewife. They did it through the radio. How do you convince a woman to abandon a recipe her mother taught her? You don't argue with her. No chart or comparison will do it. Instead, you tell her a story every single day, and you make sure your product is the one she sees when the story ends. In the early 1930s, Procter & Gamble began sponsoring daytime radio dramas. These were serialized stories, broadcast in 15-minute episodes, that followed the daily lives and emotional struggles of fictional characters. The shows were designed for women who listened to the radio while doing housework, and the companies that paid for them were selling household products, laundry soap chief among them. The connection was so obvious that a nickname emerged almost immediately. People started calling them soap operas. The phrase was partly affectionate and partly mocking, coined by critics who saw these dramas as nothing more than vehicles for selling detergent. The writer James Thurber described the strategy in blunt terms. Saturate every level of a housewife's consciousness with the miracle of a given product, so that she will be aware of it all the days of her life. Procter & Gamble didn't just sponsor these shows. The company produced them. Ma Perkins, which debuted in 1933, was one of the first. The Guiding Light followed in 1937. Both ran for decades, building enormous audiences of loyal listeners who tuned in every weekday afternoon. And here's what made the strategy so effective. These weren't 30-second commercials that listeners could ignore. They were entire programs, woven into a woman's daily routine, with the soap brand attached to every emotional moment. When television arrived in the late 1940s, the soap opera format made the leap to the small screen with ease. The Guiding Light ran simultaneously on radio and television for several years before becoming a television exclusive. As The World Turns premiered in 1956, it became one of the most watched daytime programs in the country. Its sponsor, of course, was Procter & Gamble. The company's grip on daytime programming was staggering. At its peak, Procter & Gamble was producing or sponsoring more than a dozen radio and television soap operas simultaneously. The advertising budget was enormous, nearly $500,000 for radio alone by 1931, and that number multiplied many times over when television took hold. Every commercial break featured Tide, Ivory soap, Oxydol, Dreft for baby clothes. The rotation was relentless. But did any of this actually change what women put in their washing machines? The answer, if you follow the sales numbers, is a clear yes. The television ads themselves were direct and repetitive. A smiling woman in a pressed house dress held up a box of Tide beside a basket of impossibly white laundry. The message was consistent. This product cleans better than anything you have used before, and it does it faster, with less effort, in any kind of water. Side-by-side comparisons showed Tide whites next to ordinary soap whites, and the difference was always dramatic. The Tide laundry gleaming, and the soap laundry dingy and gray. What the ads never mentioned was that the comparison was deliberately unfair. The ordinary soap was being tested in hard water, where traditional soap was guaranteed to leave residue. Tide, with its synthetic formula, had no such weakness. The demonstrations were technically accurate but designed to make the old way look as bad as possible. Would a woman watching at home have known the comparison was rigged? Almost certainly not. And that was exactly the point. The implication was clear, without ever being stated. Whatever recipe your mother taught you, this replaces it. And slowly, steadily, the message worked. The transition from homemade soap to commercial detergent didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen at the same speed everywhere. City women adopted Tide and its competitors earlier than rural women. Families with automatic washing machines switched sooner than families still using wringer washers. And economics played a role that's easy to overlook from a distance of 70 years. A box of Tide cost about 30 cents when it first hit the shelves. That doesn't sound like much now, but the average American household income in 1950 was about $3,300 a year, which works out to roughly $63 a week. A family buying groceries on that budget watched every penny. Milk cost about 41 cents for a half gallon. Coffee ran 79 cents a pound. A box of laundry detergent wasn't a trivial purchase. The homemade recipe, by contrast, cost almost nothing. A bar of Fell's naphtha soap ran about a nickel. A box of borax lasted for months. Washing soda was similarly cheap. For a family scraping by on a single income, the old recipe wasn't just tradition, it was practical arithmetic. But the post-war years were changing America's relationship with money and convenience in ways that favored commercial products. New suburban homes came equipped with modern kitchens and dedicated laundry rooms. Automatic washing machines were replacing wringer washers at an accelerating pace. Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs devoted full pages to the latest models, and for the first time, doing laundry didn't require heating water on a stove or feeding clothes through a hand-cranked wringer. The culture was shifting. The magazines, the television shows, and the advertisements all told the same story. Modern women used modern products, homemade was old-fashioned, and store-bought was progress. Good Housekeeping ran advertisements showing gleaming laundry rooms stocked with brand-name products. Ladies' Home Journal published articles praising the convenience of the new detergents. Even the women's pages of local newspapers carried Tide advertisements disguised as helpful household tips. There was also a social dimension that's easy to miss from this distance. Using commercial detergent became, subtly, a marker of class. A woman who bought Tide was keeping up with the times. A woman who still grated soap in her basement was behind. The message was never spoken so bluntly, but it filtered through 1,000 small signals. What the neighbor used, what the magazine recommended, what the woman on television held up and smiled about. By the mid-1950s, the handwritten recipe cards that mothers had once tucked into her daughters' hope chests were beginning to disappear, not because the recipe had stopped working, but because the world it belonged to was dissolving. The farmhouse with the back porch washtub was giving way to the ranch house with the Maytag in the basement. The wringer washer was heading to the curb, and the women who had spent their Mondays over a scrub board were raising daughters who'd never touch one. The knowledge didn't vanish all at once. Grandmothers in Appalachian hollers and rural farm wives across the Great Plains kept making their own soap well into the 1960s and the 1970s. For them, the old ways weren't nostalgia, they were survival. When the nearest grocery store was 30 miles down a dirt road, you made what you needed from what you had. And what you had was fat, ash, borax, and time. But for the broad American middle class, the switch was complete within a single generation. By 1960, the grocery store laundry aisle looked much the way it does today, lined with boxes and bottles of synthetic detergent in competing brands. Tide, Cheer, All, Whisk, and a growing lineup of specialized products for every conceivable laundry need. The three-ingredient recipe was gone from mainstream life, remembered only by the women who had grown up making it. But decades later, something unexpected happened. In the early 2000s, a quiet movement began gathering strength in corners of the internet that celebrated self-sufficiency, homesteading, and a return to the domestic skills of earlier generations. Young women, many of them mothers, looking for alternatives to the chemical-laden products on store shelves, started searching for the old recipes. And they found them. The three-ingredient formula was still there, hiding in plain sight. Fels Naphtha soap, now manufactured by a different company, but still wrapped in the same old-fashioned paper packaging, was still available on the bottom shelf of most grocery stores. 20 Mule Team Borax still sat in its familiar green box in the cleaning aisle. Arm & Hammer Super Washing Soda was right beside it. The ingredients had been there for decades, patiently waiting on the shelf for someone to remember what they were for. Blog posts and online tutorials began circulating, many of them prefaced by the same sentiment. My grandmother used to make this. Women shared photos of cheese graters covered in yellow soap shavings, 5-gallon buckets of homemade detergent, and side-by-side comparisons showing that the old recipe cleaned just as well as the commercial alternative at a fraction of the cost. YouTube channels dedicated to homesteading and traditional domestic arts posted step-by-step videos that racked up millions of views. The comments sections on these videos told their own story. Women wrote about calling their mothers and grandmothers to ask for the recipe, only to discover that many of them still remembered it. One commenter wrote that her mama said she made it until 1968, when Daddy got a raise and she decided to try the store-bought kind. She said the store-bought was never as good, but by then everyone else was using it, and she felt silly being the only one still grating soap. Others shared memories of helping their grandmothers with the process as children, standing on a stool to stir the melted soap shavings, or being sent to the basement to fetch the borax box. For many, the recipe was tangled up with larger memories of a specific person, a specific kitchen, a specific era of their lives that was gone. The math was persuasive. A batch of homemade laundry soap made from 1 bar of Fels Naphtha, half a cup of borax, and 1 cup of washing soda could wash more than 60 loads of laundry. The total cost of ingredients was roughly $3. That worked out to about 5 cents per load, compared to 20 to 30 cents per load for a major brand like Tide. But the modern revival was about more than money. It was about something harder to measure. A feeling that an important thread had been cut when the old recipes disappeared. The women who posted these tutorials were not pretending to live in the 1950s. They were asking a different question. What else did we stop doing for ourselves without realizing what we were giving up? Not everything about the old way was better, of course. The labor was grueling, the hard water problem was real, and lye soap made from scratch, the kind that required handling caustic chemicals over an open fire, was dangerous. The women who did that work did not romanticize it. They were glad when easier options came along. To suggest otherwise would be dishonest about the physical toll that wash day demanded from millions of women, year after year, decade after decade. But the recipe itself, The three ingredients mixed in a coffee tin and measured out by the tablespoon, that was something different. Knowledge. Practical, useful knowledge that a person could carry with her anywhere, that cost almost nothing, and that connected her to every woman in her family who had ever stood over a washtub on a Monday morning. The bright orange Tide box promised liberation from all that. And in many ways, it delivered. Laundry became easier, faster, and more effective. But in the rush toward the modern, something small and useful was left behind in the kitchen drawer, folded inside a recipe card that no one thought to save. The women of the 1950s did not buy laundry detergent because they did not need to. They already had something that worked. It was only when an entire industry spent decades telling them otherwise that they finally let it go. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, the kind that make you look twice at the objects in your own home, there is more where this came from. Hit subscribe, and the next time a forgotten piece of everyday history surfaces, you'll be the first to know.